Hello everybody and welcome to CAD-Prof.com. This is lesson 7 of a 10-part series, CAD for Landscape. You'll notice that my desk is slightly different. I have the CAD file open from last day, but I've also opened up the PDF file. Today our focus is on dimensioning, and we have to identify a number of parts and pieces in order to be able to move forward with the menus that we're going to be looking at. So first of all, I'd like to discuss the items that I have placed on the pre-printed material. So we create dimension styles, and within these dimension styles, we adjust a number of the different values so that they meet the standards of the industry. Landscape, architectural, interior designs, they typically follow the same format only because they become part of the same drawing set. So there's a number of items that we're going to be reviewing. I just want to draw your attention to the layers that we're going to be creating, the scale information that I've shown here. So first of all, we have to identify how we're going to dimension. There's two basic formats. You can either do a baseline series of dimensions, or you can do what's referred to as a continuous line of dimensions. Both of them start with what's called a linear dimension, and as we work on the actual project, this will make more sense to you. A linear dimension simply defines that we're either going horizontal or vertical with a dimension. So we start with a linear, and then we select whether it's a baseline format or whether it's a continuous format. And a baseline format simply makes the first point of the first dimension the first point of the second, the first point of the third. So they all initiate from the same point reference. Whereas a continuous dimension works slightly different. We have the first point of the first dimension, the second point of the first dimension, but that becomes the first point of the second dimension, and that becomes the first point of the third, and so on and so forth. So it allows us to create a continuous dimension string. So you can see here that this is a continuous dimension string, this is a continuous dimension string, this is a baseline dimension string. And then you look at the parts and pieces of a dimension. You have an extension line, which is a line that represents object that we're trying to dimension. So in this case, that extension line from the top of the bar to the bottom of the bar is 3 feet. So we have those extension lines. If you take a look at the graphic, we've got a number of different bars that are there that we're dimensioning, and that's where all these numbers are being generated. It's also representative of the L1 drawing that I provided in the very first lesson. The dimensions on the left represent the same items only from a base point or a baseline point. And then you have the dimension line. So the dimension line is where we place the text. In all three disciplines in design, we place the text above the line and we make the line continuous. So when we refer to the dimension style, we're going to be looking at a number of items. These are referred to as arrowheads, even though they're architectural ticks. So anything that represents the intersection between the extension line and the dimension line refers to an arrowhead. And then we have information such as how tall is the text? What is the gap between the text and the dimension line? How do we treat fractions? Are they going to be stacked diagonally or vertically? And then we talk about text placement. Where is the text actually being placed? This series of instructions here directly relates to the menu, and again, that will become more apparent. We're going to create a dimension layer for each of the 3 dimension scales we're working on this drawing. Now, there is a different way of doing this with the associate method, but what I find is that if you have to make any modifications or changes, you lose a lot of that data. So it's very important that you understand the fundamentals of what we're doing here today. Also, when we refer to CAD, we draw full scale, as you know. Every object that we drew in this particular example, we drew full size. So we drew a 1-inch overhang, 11-inch column, and so on. When we actually go to plot, that's when we plot to a scale. And we have to zoom in at a certain factor on our window to represent that scale. And that's what these numbers represent here. So I've done a very quick summary of some of the more common unit measurements we're going to be using in this exercise. I've also shown how to calculate this, and it has to do with changing how we typically look at our scale, 1/4 inch equals 1 foot, to a ratio, and the ratio always has to end up in a 1 to something. So anytime you have a particular scale, you can add this formula to it to actually determine the drawing scale that CAD understands and will be used to represent the images that we'll be zooming in on. This also affects the line type scale and the hatch scale, so it's something that we fundamentally need to know. If you have not booted up CAD and not opened up the drawing at this point, stop the video and then catch up so that we can start referring to this. Also, the PDF on the right that I've shown here, print it off. You may want to add some additional notes to it. I'll be closing it down momentarily. I'm going to pick up from where we left off last day and click on the layer creation icon. And here I'm going to make the 3 layers that are on the PDF file. So the first one is dim 24. I'm going to make that red. And the next one I have on that sheet is dim 4. Dim 4, it's already red. And then the last one I'm going to do is dim x2 or times 2. This particular scale is twice the actual scale, and that's why we have the times 2 reference. The dim 24 represents anything that I'm going to be drawing in the half-inch scale, and the dim 4 represents anything that I'm going to be drawing in the 3-inch scale. So now that I have my 3 layers created, I'm going to close down the Layers property menu and adjust my precision settings. I'm going to type in the word units and press enter. And in this menu we have our precision set to 1/16. We're going to change that to 1/64. Now this is only really relevant to versions of CAD that are 2016 and moving forward to about 2018. In 2020 they've corrected this one problem, but we're all going to adjust this just in case you have an earlier version of CAD. And now that we've done that, we can move forward to actually creating dimension styles. In the annotation menu, there's a drop down. Click on the arrow that points down. This is where we can actually adjust the dimension style. There's several different types of styles that we can change here, but we're going to focus on dimensioning. We start with standard, which is the default setting. We have to start somewhere, and then we're going to make a copy of this and adjust the values. So here I'm going to select new. And notice it says start with standard. Once we have a version, then we'll be starting with that because then we make very few adjustments. Here we have to make quite a few. And we're going to call this one dim 24. Once again, this represents the scale that we're going to be using in that particular drawing. Now, regardless of what pops up here in your tabs, click on the Symbols and Arrows tab. Now, this is why we had made that adjustment with the actual unit value, so we can see the precision level has increased to allow us to type in smaller values. So here, for arrowheads, you'll notice they have a standard arrowhead. We're going to select architectural ticks. So anything that's a dimension line will have these little tick values, but we're going to leave leaders with an actual arrowhead. This diagram to the right tries to represent the changes that we're making. The arrow size itself here, we're going to change to 3/64. So 3/64. Press enter. And if they become too small, we'll change that later on. I want to go back and forth in this menu so you can become familiar with it. For center marks, we're going to use none. Notice here how a radial dimension has this plus sign. If I change it to lines, it extends the plus sign out beyond the edge of the circle. We're going to use the none option, so nothing is represented in the center. In regards to the arc length and all of that, we're just going to leave it as is. Now let's go to the Lines tab. The Lines tab refers to dimension lines, extension lines, and all the different values that are on the right side of the PDF file that I've shown you earlier. Now you'll notice that there's a section up here that refers to color, line type, line weight. We allow layers to control that, so we never have to dive into this part of the menu. So here I'm going to change extend beyond ticks to 1/16 of an inch. And you can see that once again being reflected on the PDF file. On the right drawing where there's the finial, it shows you what we're actually adjusting. Offset from origin, we're going to leave it at 1/16. So that's the gap between what we click on the object and where the extension line starts. Fixed length extension line, we're going to change this to 3/8 of an inch. Now this is a good practice, so anytime we move dimensions away from objects, we have a fixed length to what this is regardless of where we have actually selected on the object where that dimension is going to start. I'm okay with the right side of this menu. We're going to also change here baseline spacing to 3/8 of an inch. Now baseline spacing is the gap between multiple dimensions using baseline dimensioning. So this will allow us to select our second dimension and automatically place the dimension line a preset distance. And that's what we want to do here. Okay, let's move on to text. For text height, we're going to change that to 3/32 of an inch. For the offset from the dimension line, we're going to change that to 1/8 of an inch. So offset from dimension line is actually the gap from the actual dimension line to where we put the numbers. Now, this drawing here doesn't represent that right now because of where we were placing the text. So we're going to be changing that. This menu down here represents the PDF file in the upper left-hand corner. So for vertical, we're going to select above. For horizontal, we're going to leave it at centered. And for view direction is left to right. Now watch what happens to this screen, this image up here, when we select Align with Dimension Line. So this is more representative of what we typically do in this industry standard. So let's move to the Fit tab. In the Fit tab, we want to always keep the text between the extension lines. Now we will be adjusting this later on when the text overlaps. It'll allow us to do a free movement of it, but for now just keep it in between the extension lines. We always want the text placed over the dimension line and without a leader. And that's simply when there's dimensions that are too close, it'll pop it out and add an extra line. We don't want to use any leaders with that. Now for the scale of the dimension features, this directly relates to the scale of the drawing or the viewport. Remember, we're working with DIM 24. So this particular value is 24 to represent the scale. When we duplicate this dimension style into DIM 4 or DIM times 2, this is the only number we're going to have to change. We always want to draw the dimension line between extension lines. So if we have a number of extension lines in between here, it doesn't miss the gap. There's a number of rules that AutoCAD implements to determine where the tick is, the dimension is, extension lines, dimension lines. So this will make sure that we always have a dimension line. And in here, we're going to change the primary units from decimal to architectural, and precision refers to actually our drawing and what's the smallest value. We're going to change that to 1/8 of an inch. And now you can see this more or less represents how we want our dimensions to look. Fractional formats, there's a couple of different types. Horizontal, diagonal, we're just going to leave it at horizontal. Now, down at the bottom, we have this zero suppression. So zero suppression refers to how a dimension appears. For instance, if I do feet suppression, whenever I have a measurement like 11 inches, it will not show me 0 feet 11 inches. It'll simply show me the 11 inches. So we want feet suppression on. But if I get a dimension such as 1 foot 0 inches, I can actually say I don't want that 0 to be indicated, and I can take that off. Or I can leave it on so it always represents the number including the inch value. We're going to leave this one on, and if there need be a change later on, we can go back to this menu and adjust it. Okay, we don't have to change anything else. Select OK. There's a dimension style. Click on it. Select Set Current. Now that's something we can change in some of the other menus, but for now let's set that current and close this menu. So now we're going to refer to our L1 drawing that has all the dimensions already on the drawing and try to repeat them on our project. I'm first going to switch from the viewport layer to the DIM 24 layer. I'm going to go into annotation to make sure my dimension is using the DIM 24 style. This number and that number should be the same. We always start with a linear dimension. So you can see in the menu here, it says linear. We'll click on that. Now the object snap setting is already looking for intersections or endpoints. I'm going to click on this part of the footing, the lowest part, and then move upwards to the second part of the footing and stretch my dimension out and click. Let's zoom in on this to see what we've actually done. There's all the adjustment values that we did. Provide the dimension line. There's our extension line. Here is our gap. So now that we've drawn our first dimension, we simply go back, but instead of using the menu that's up in here in annotation, we're going to use our secondary menu where it says dimension. And here we then move to either continue or baseline. There's our two different styles, and the little diagram to the left of them sort of reflects what we're going to be doing. So click on continue. Now it's automatically looking for the second point. If we take a look at the drawing that we were working on, the second point is this second grade line that we have. And then we move up to the top of the foundation wall. I'm going to zoom out. I'm going to pan, zoom back in. And I'm going to dimension the base of the cap, the midpoint of the cap, the top of the cap, and then press enter. There's our dimension string. Notice it generates the number for us, not the other way around. Now notice how we have zero suppression on the 4-foot mark. Let's change that. I'm going to go back into annotation, go back to the dimension style. Dim 24 is already selected. This time instead of new, we're going to click on modify. When I click on modify, I'm going to go into the primary units, and zero suppression I do not want on inches. So I'm going to select that, select OK, close the menu, and now it reads 4-foot 0, 4-foot 0, exactly the way the drawing is shown in L1. So that's the basics to dimensioning. We're going to now adjust some of the information that we have. I'm just going to remove this construction line that I have here from an earlier time. And I want to zoom in at the top. Notice how the 2-inch and the 2-inch are interfering with one another. If you click on any of the dimensions, you'll notice that there's a number of different points that are identified. It identifies what we selected to generate our extension lines from. It points out the line level of the dimension itself. The dimension line itself can be up or down, and then it shows you the text. What's nice about this setup is if I click on the number 2, I can actually move that. I want to have this 2 in line with the other one, so I'll press F8, my ortho key, and now it places it perfectly in alignment with the other. This 2 is interfering with this extension line, so I'll click on that, and I'll move it over. Now, there's another adjustment we can make. For instance, in here, I've shown that the line, the extension line above the dimension line, is fairly significant. Let's see if we can adjust that. Since this dimension is selected, I'm going to press Escape. I'm going to go back into Annotation, Dimension Style, Modify, and let's see where we can find this extension line, which seems to be rather large. If I go into Lines, I have a number of different values here. This is my offset from origin. There's my fixed length. Oh, extend beyond dimension lines. That's really big, so I don't want that. I want sort of similar to what I have in my other values. So I'm going to change that to a 1/16 of an inch. Press Enter. Select OK. Make sure this is already selected. If it's grade, it is. Close that. And look, it's already made that adjustment. Now that's kind of nice because now I can move the 2's a bit closer together to make the drawing a bit neater. You can see how important it is that we understand that menu. This is the style I want continuously throughout the project. There are other techniques you should be aware of. I'm rolling my mouse to zoom outwards, and then I'm holding down the wheel to pan, and rolling it once again to zoom in. Let's take a look at some of the dimensioning that goes on at the bottom of this footing. You'll notice on L1 I've defined the width of the projections of the footing as well as the width of the actual foundation wall. We're going to start with linear, click that on, and I want to pick up the corner of the bottom of the footing. My next point is at the base of the foundation, and I'm going to move my mouse down and then click on the position. So you'll notice that the left extension line picked up the base of the footing because I clicked on this intersection and it provided the gap. You'll notice my second dimension picked up the base of the foundation and provided the gap. Now that's critical because had I started with rather than the bottom of the footing, the top of it, this extension line would actually overlap the object. And if I'm printing in black and white, I may not understand what that's actually referring to. So our selection points are very critical to make sure our dimensions look correct. So let's continue on with the dimensioning of the footing. I'm going to click on Dimension in the menu at the top of the screen, Continue, click on the foundation width and the bottom. Now I'm just going to click on the top to show you how to correct this in case you do make an error. And I'm going to press enter. So now you can see how this extension line is going over top of the footing and it's not going to print correctly. So I'm going to press escape. I'm going to click on this dimension and notice I've got this node that's showing where I had clicked to select the width of this dimension. I'm going to click on that and move down to the base of the footing and press escape, and now I've got my gap. That's exactly what I want for this project. Good technique to know how to adjust it in case you select something incorrectly rather than undo and then redo it. Now I want a baseline dimension that starts from that first dimension of this continuous series. So I'm going to go into my dimension menu at the top of the screen and I'm going to select baseline. Now I've always said you have to start with a linear, but if I have an existing dimension I can start with numbers that are already there. You'll notice when I select dimension baseline, it's asking me to select the base dimension. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to click on that base number. Now sometimes what I'll say down here is exactly what I've got, where it says or select. In that case you press S and enter. And I'm going to click on the width of the footing, and now it wants to continue baselining the dimension set. Now I'll go back into the menu, click on dimension and continue, and I'm going to move to the gap between footings and then the width of the footing and then press enter. And that's how we pick up a baseline dimension from a continued dimension. And now we have this gap set exactly the way we've positioned it in our dimension style. So we've got an 1/8 inch gap, an 1/8 inch text, and an 1/8 inch to the next dimension line. That's our 3/8 inch baseline dimension setting. So sometimes students want me to repeat what I've done, and I'm going to be doing that with the fencing material up here. So I've panned, I moved my drawing over, and I'm going to dimension this set of elements here. So I'm going to start with linear, and I'm going to click on the base of the footing where it meets the grade and the base of the column, and I'm sliding over. Now what I'm determining how much of a gap I have here, because the rest of the string will continue along there. So there's my 6 inch. So from here I'm going to select continue. So dimension, continue, and I'll select the base of the bar and the next bar settings as well as the one above. There's my sequence of dimensions, press enter, and then I want to use a baseline setting for the next one. So I'll go into dimension, baseline, and notice how it's picking up right from where I left off at the top, because it thinks I want to pick up that baseline from this 1 inch point, but I don't. So at the bottom of my screen I have a select function. So I'm going to type in the letter S and enter. And that baseline I want it to pick up from the one that's down here. Notice I'm picking the lower one. Then I can go to the top of the fence picket and then press enter. And my baseline dimension is exactly where I want it, the right distance away, and it's picked up from where I want that particular element. Now notice all these ones, they're kind of being interfered with. This won't print properly. So I'll press escape. I'm going to zoom in on it. Click on the text. There we go. Then click on the text node, slide it over where my F8 is on, so I'm getting a nice parallel slide. And I'll roll my wheel, I'll pan, I'll click on this one and slide that over, and then click on this one, slide that over, press escape, zoom out, and that dimension string is done. So you can see dimensioning is very quick. It's putting in the value of the numbers, not you. So somebody will ask me, well, what if the number is wrong? That means your drawing's wrong. Redraw it, adjust it, correct it, and then redimension it. Or you can leave the dimension as is, correct the drawing, and then clicking on the dimensions themselves, you can then adjust the nodes to the new portion of the drawing. One of the most powerful tools we can use is the stretch command. So let me show you how this works. So I'm going to go into the modify menu and select stretch. Notice the icon and how it looks. Click on that. It's also available here. Stretch is interesting because what it actually does is it moves any object within its crossing. You have to use crossing right to left. So in this case I want to move this bar down 1 inch. So what it does is any line that it crosses, it will stretch either up or down, and anything that's enclosed in that object, it will simply move that object. So I've enclosed the object. Press enter. Click somewhere on a blank part of the page and type in an x and y value to move that down. In this case, I'm going to type in 0, -1. Now, watch my dimensions on the right side. See what's happened? The one above is 1'5", the one below is 1'4". I'm going to press Control Z, undo that, and I'll try it again with something else that's on my drawing. So let's say, for instance, I want to stretch the columns to be shorter. I'm going to use a slightly different technique here. So modify stretch. This time I'm going to stretch just the column lines. So notice I'm only crossing the two green lines, but I'm also crossing the dimension, so it stretches with it. Anything enclosed in this box will move with it. So the cap will move with the box. The two 2-inch dimensions will move with the box. But where I have 4 feet and the column, that's actually going to adjust. So there's my second point on my corner. I don't want to stretch anything else. I press enter. Click anywhere on your page, and I'm going to make this 6 inches shorter. So here I'm going to type in 0, -6, press enter, and now that column is 3'6". So any adjustment can be made after we dimension, but we have to make sure it has to be included in our stretch crossing. So let's try to do some other stretch techniques. What I'm going to do here, I'm just panning it in place, is each one of these pickets is the wrong height. I want it to match the arc that I've created here. So the first thing I'm going to do is offset the arc 3 inches. Now this isn't dimensioned. It's simply something that I've selected as a value. And it's to help us practice with stretch. The pickets that are on the right, I want to stretch from the left side of the picket down to touch the arc in each case. The pickets that are on the left, I want the right side of the picket to come down and touch the arc. And this allows us to practice stretch. Now I'm going to use the icon instead. So I'll click on stretch. I'm going to make a crossing over the picket. And again, the crossing must include the top of the picket and then cross over the lines I want to adjust in their size. Press enter. Click on the upper left side of the picket and then click on the arc. I'm going to press enter again. Click, click, enter, click, click. So we're going to get used to this pattern. So I'm going to pan over, press enter, click, click, enter, click, click, and repeat the process. So you can see how this can be very quick if we practice using this. And in some cases, like here, I was slightly out of sequence. I've got the nodes. Simply press escape, go back to the stretch command, and try it again. Now this one's really small. I want to zoom in on it. So when I cross it, I don't cross the arc. So I don't pick one of the 3 nodes that represents the arc. This one's a bit unusual because when I select it and click on that corner, it doesn't have an intersection. If I have F8 on, it will go straight up and down, but I can't pick that intersection correctly. I must go beyond the intersection and then do another stretch from the top down. So the stretch command, you can see how powerful this tool is. Practice it, try it. It's very important that you understand how to use it. It's not used that often, but it's a powerful tool when changes are going to be made. And one thing I know, in every drawing, there's always changes. Now we've done a lot of work on this, so let's save this. I'm going to select File, Save As. And this is part of Lesson 7, so I'm going to move to the Lesson 7 folder. L1, select Save. I'm going to roll my mouse to zoom out. Let's see how this looks like in our title block. So I'm going to click on the L1 layout, and there's our drawing. Now in order for us to actually have this at the right scale, remember this drawing is a 1/2 inch scale. According to the information I provided to you earlier, a 1/2 inch scale is 1:24. So this is how we set up the drawing. I'm going to double click inside this viewport, and you'll notice that the viewport layer will become bolded. I'm going to type in the letter Z and enter. You'll notice on my cursor it says scale factor NX or NXP. What we type in now is 1/24 XP and press enter. That is a 1/2 inch scale equals 1 foot 0 inches. In fact, if you look at the bottom of my screen in the drawing aids area, it actually identifies that I've drawn this at a 1/2 inch equals 1 foot. I can also use this menu to scale a window. I simply click on it and I can click on some of the automated settings, but it's very important that we understand the settings and how we derive them. So notice how in my window I don't have all my dimensions visible. No problem. As I'm double clicked inside of this, I can use the pan control, and as I move my window around, it then reveals more of the dimensions. This is exactly what I want. So, File, Save, and now I'm ready to move on to the next lesson. Well, thank you for joining me today. I know that this lesson was packed full of information, but with practice and time, you'll start getting a handle on it, and you'll feel more and more comfortable with it every day. I look forward to seeing you next time.